The world has made a mockery of biblical faith. It has done so because of the way it understands religion. The Collins Concise Dictionary, for example, defines religion as belief in, worship of, or in obedience to powers considered to be divine. Considered to be divine. Religion has become the main subject for the world, and faith has been made a simple feature of religion. Thus we have the faith of Muslims, of Hindus, of Buddhists, and so forth, and even of Christians. Never mind that the Bible gives no prominence to religion at all, mentioning it only 7 times in the NIV Bible, with the first occasion being in Amos chapter 2, verse 27, where God said, "I hate your religious feasts." Never mind that faith is the prominent word of the Bible, and that Jesus is its author and perfecter, as stated in Hebrews chapter 12, verses 1 and 2. Never mind that the Bible speaks of one faith, along with one body, one Spirit, one hope, one Lord, one baptism, and one God, in Ephesians chapter 4, verses 4 to 6. John chapter 9, verses 1 to 41, provides an excellent opportunity to see Jesus handling the difference between religious frameworks based on interpretations and faith based on revelation, between the weakness of religion and the strength of faith. Stop this presentation now and read or listen to this passage. We need to keep in mind 3 previously learned lessons as we look at the context of this 9th chapter of John. First, this series has demonstrated again and again the differences and the relationship between human life and God's divine life. This chapter is one of 4 from chapter 7 to 10 that show those dynamics as they affect human-centered religious frameworks and reasoning. This chapter joins the other 3 to show tense, complex arguments between Jesus with his divine reasoning and the people, Jewish leaders as well as common people, with their human reasoning. So keep this feature in mind as you study this chapter. The second lesson for this chapter is the fact that the healing recorded is the 7th healing of 7 healings that occurred on the Sabbath. It was noted that the other 6 are found in Mark chapter 1 and chapter 3, in Luke chapter 13 and 14, and in John chapter 5, as we have seen before. The timing of those healings created great turbulent conflict between Jesus and the religious leaders, between divine life-centered revelation and divine reasoning as opposed to human life-centered interpretations of worldviews and human reasoning. The healing of this chapter is the last Sabbath day healing recorded in the Gospels, and it had a very significant place in the conflict between God's life and human life as seen in Jesus. The third lesson to be remembered as this chapter unfolds is that of the mistaken notions about miracles as held by the people present on such occasions. As we have seen, the common people sought the works of Jesus as seen in his miracles, but ignored the words of Jesus as seen in his teachings. We have also seen that the mistake made by the religious leaders was that of judging Jesus by the standards of their own interpretations and experiences with no reference to the divine side of his presence with them. Yet, those religious notions provided no answers that made sense. They ended in frustration, and like all such religious notions, they ended up in dissatisfactory contradictions of small life-centered reasoning. This third lesson is demonstrated right away by the disciples when they saw the man blind from birth. And what did they ask Jesus? They asked a religious question of him. They said, "Who sinned, the man or his parents?" in chapter 9, verses 1-3. Like others of their day, they easily succumbed to the religious notions that such suffering was related to sin. The Lord immediately distanced himself from such human-based religious beliefs in chapter 9, verses 4-5. Now, why did he do so? It's because his life did not fit within such religious frameworks. His life, as will be seen, was about faith. Jesus drew attention to divine life and its ways of faith, not human life and its ways of religion. He had done this so exquisitely by divine reasoning in chapters 7 and 8, as we have seen. Here, he would do it by divine demonstration. He was never caught up in the darkness of human reasoning, but in the light of divine reasoning. The works of God, not the sins of people, were his focus. And he wanted that focus to be that of the disciples to whom he said. And so that's why it said, he spoke these words, "As long as it is day, or as long as there is light, we must do the works of him who sent me. Night is coming when no one can work." Jesus went on to say, "While I am in the world, I am the light of the world." He had taught this most significantly during his time at the Feast of Tabernacles, when he contrasted the lights at the feast, burning for 7 days, with his light burning when? Forever. He was about to demonstrate the same truth in the healing of this blind man. He would contrast the blindness of the man with the blindness of the religious leaders. And here he would relate his light of revelation to the response of faith. Jesus then healed the man according to John chapter 9, verses 6-8. His actions were unusual. A mud pack made with his own saliva. That action itself was a deliberate flaunting of a Pharisaic law that forbade that specific act on the Sabbath. His action also demonstrated revelation. The man's actions, on the other hand, were a simple act of faith, a washing in the pool of Siloam as instructed by Jesus. The man was not able to see until he had obeyed. And this is where faith came into the picture. This was where faith moved beyond the religious framework that had always explained his blindness according to human worldviews and interpretations. His faith did not occur in the darkness of human experience, but in the light of divine revelation and divine expression. Jesus touched his eyes and commanded him to obey. Without even knowing it, the man demonstrated faith beyond religious frameworks, the kind of faith God always seeks. In verses 9-12, we begin to see the aftermath of this healing, and we see how the pre-existing religious framework was related to the darkness of interpretations, while faith was related to the light of revelation. The neighbors demonstrated their inability to explain and answer questions from within their religious frameworks. Their opinions were confused. They had no way to accept this dramatic change in the man. They relied on their previous knowledge and worldview, showing the darkness of their religious thinking. Finally, in verses 13-16, the neighbors demonstrated the darkness of their own thinking by giving up all explanations and taking the beggar to the religious experts. There again, with those experts, the darkness of interpretation tried to explain what only the light of revelation can illuminate. The Pharisees actually showed the real contrast between religious darkness and faith's light. Having no place for Jesus as the life-in, life-man of God, They referred to him only as the man, human life, without divine life. They were interested in the healing experience only as a human experience. They asked how, with the expectations that answers had to fit their religious framework. Some connected the events only to their human traditions about the Sabbath. Others could see the event only in terms of sin and sinners. Religious thinking prevailed. They groped in their religious darkness with no concept of revelation's light. The Bible says they were divided. So let it be noted that such division is the only outcome when interpretations and worldviews prevail, while revelation is denied. Dark religious frameworks also influenced the blind man, as seen in verse 17. Remember, he had not seen Jesus. His first sight was that of the water in the pool of Siloam. Being blind from birth, he had no visual framework. He had no visual history or experience. Suddenly, he was asked what he saw. So just imagine the difficulty he must have had in explaining. Interestingly, the religious darkness, as seen in the leaders, was asking human darkness, as seen in the man. Religious darkness sought the light of human interpretations, but had no concept of the divine light of revelation. Very wisely, the man formerly blind said, he gave a religious answer. He said, he is a prophet. Next, religious darkness sought proof from human darkness, like the blind leading the blind. Now, why do I say this? It has to do with the way the parents responded to the religious leaders. In verses 18 to 23, they offered safe information from their human experience. They said, he is our son. He was born blind. They did not venture into unsafe territory about Jesus. And they said, we don't know how he can now see. We don't know who opened his eyes. They proved what they could without being judged religiously so as to be put out of the synagogue for making any suggestion that Jesus was the Messiah. The religious framework captivated the discussion once again when darkness sought now truth, as the religious leaders turned to more questions for the lowly beggar in verses 24 to 34. They spoke as experts on God's glory, but viewed that glory in the darkness of their religion, not in the light of God's revelation. They were keen to uphold their definitions of sin and sinners. The man's faith was of no interest to them. Their religious framework was more important than God's desire for faith. The man answered simply. He said, the truth I know has nothing to do with sin or sinners. The truth I know is that I was blind, but now I see. That's in verse 25. They were concerned for the law. That blind man was concerned for the life he had been given. They had not yet listened to the truth he told them in verse 27. And he facetiously suggested it was because maybe they wanted to follow the one who healed him. Yet, for the experts, the religious framework needed to be defended. So the leaders reacted harshly to the man's comments in verses 28 and 29. With nothing positive to say from their dull framework, they instead hurled insults and accusations at the man. They went on to defend their own religious status, very important. They said, we are disciples of Moses. They declared their inability and unwillingness to include Jesus in their religious framework. They said, we don't even know where he comes from. They, on the other hand, were priests because of 100-year history. They went backward to religion, but the beggar went forward in faith. In simple faith, the man had responded by obeying Jesus. He didn't bathe elsewhere. He could have, but he bathed in the pool of Siloam. And by doing so, he showed his willingness to step out of his religious framework and respond to God's revelation by an act of faith. That's in verses 30 and 31. And so the man concluded, if this man were not from God, he could do nothing. One last religious put-down existed for the Pharisees. To the man they said, you were steeped in sin at birth. How dare you lecture us? And they threw him out of their temple. Where did the blind man land? Right in the framework of faith. That's what we see in verses 35 to 38. Jesus was there. And Jesus asked, do you believe in the Son of Man? To the man's desire to know this Son of Man, Jesus said, I am he. And the Bible says the man believed and worshipped Christ. His faith had progressed from knowing Jesus as the man they called Jesus, in verse 11, to a prophet, verse 17, to a man from God, that's in verses 32 and 33, and finally to the Son of Man, in verses 38 and 39. He began seeing the revelation of God's life in a human life, called Jesus. So what is the nature of this faith that exists beyond religious frameworks? It is not part of a religion. It is not a subset of religion. It is not part of a religious framework controlled by those who claim authority. Faith is related to revelation, not to human worldviews and interpretations. It is our response to God's revelation, not our submission to our religious framework. Faith allows God to touch our lives any way he wants, like the way Jesus touched the blind man. Faith does what God commands, like the blind man doing what Jesus said. Faith journeys toward God up to the point of worship and commitment, like the blind man. So as we conclude this message, 3 questions deserve our attention. Number 1, in what ways has your faith been like that of the blind man? And number 2, in what ways, if any, are you able to separate your faith from religious frameworks like that blind man did? And number 3, how important is it for you to distinguish between religious frameworks and faith? How important is it where you live? And why is it important?